mental health and psychiatry and psychological therapy and psychology and all of this big domain, it's actually nothing more than our culture. It's not just heavily influenced by our culture, it is purely our culture. And that's fair enough, because all human beings throughout history have seen the world and acted in the world according to their cultural imprint, naturally. And that's fair enough, because that's what happens. But there's something tricky going on here in the mental health realm, if we can call it that, because we are passing it off not as culture but as objective science, which has the effect of we can't question it. It's science. What kind of backwards person would be questioning science? But it isn't science. Number of scientists have gone on record, proper scientists, I mean scientists that actually do science, have gone on record and saying, hey, that stuff ain't science. It presents as science. It has the facade of science. It has lots of stats, and when you write it up in a paper, it looks very impressive because there's lots of terminology and there's lots of rigorous whatever. But behind all of that, according to Richard Feynman, for example, voted at one point in his life as the most intelligent man on the world, which, who knows, may have been true, may not have been true. He was smart, all right, that's for sure. He said what's behind that is in the social sciences isn't science at all, because it doesn't even have any of the principles of science. Because in order to be science, it would have to be based on deep principles that actually exist and aren't just artifacts of our way of thinking. And anything we say about mental health is purely our undigested assumptions, our undigested prejudices. We haven't got a clue what mental health is. What we say is mental health could be the exact opposite, and what we say is terrible mental health could be good mental health. We really don't know what it is. Now we could say, okay, when people are happy and smiley and everything's lovely, that's mental health. That's a nice simplistic way of putting it. So it's like folk in cartoons, people in adverts. I don't know why I said folk in cartoons, but people in adverts, happy and bouncy and sparkly and all of that. And then maybe we can be like that too. But does that mean we're mentally healthy? And the answer is, well, probably not, because what we're doing is we could just be deluded. So it's like we could belong to some cult and then believe that we've got the right way of looking at things, and we're destined for salvation, unlike the rest of the poor suckers that we see around us, and that we're doing it right, and that everything's great. So we feel happy on the basis of that self-delusion. Now, it's easy to point at a really extreme cult and say, look at them lads, they're self-deluded. But society is a cult, and we are self-deluding in accordance with the premises of society when we think we're happy because we're doing the things that society say should make us happy, or are evidence of us being well-adjusted or anything like that. So it all comes back to this thing of culture, really. So it could be said that our culture is a particular type of culture, different from other cultures that have come before. And we could say that our culture is rational technological. It's rational because it sees everything in terms of objective truths that can be proved. And it's technological because we can harness those rational truths in order to do stuff, real stuff. So it's kind of the proof of the pudding, really. Throughout human history, I've had all sorts of ideas and beliefs, and that's just about what they were. ideas or beliefs. Nothing much came out of them because they could equally well have been different ideas or beliefs. But the thing about having ideas about how energy works or what the constituents of matter are is that our ideas and hypotheses about it lead on to all sorts of fantastic technology that obviously shows we've got it right. Like we wouldn't be able to we wouldn't be able to go on Zoom meetings or look at our phones unless there was something in the way we were looking at the world that is objectively correct. And that's all very well. And it is certainly true that if you've got a mobile phone, which undoubtedly you have, that mobile phone is evidence that we've got real understanding of how the physical world works. You can't deny it. But the problem comes in when we try and pass off mental health in the same way that we do our knowledge of the physical world, the natural sciences, when we try and say, well, we're on the same footing as that. So just as we understand what makes electrons spin or what makes this do that or what the ingredients of atomic structure are, and can go on to make quantum computers or whatever, we also know what's going on in terms of our mental health or our mental ill health, and we know how to deal with that and have an equivalent ability to do something with that. And we don't. It should be very clear that we don't, because the amount of people suffering from anxiety and depression is increasing despite all of our very best technology. So if the technology worked, it would go down, one would think. Instead, it's been going up, and it's predicted to keep on going up. And that it goes up and it goes up, and it doesn't matter how many new antidepressants we invent or how many new rational therapies we come out. That tends to imply that maybe we don't understand in the same way that we understand electrons or what quantum mechanics is. So we can't really pass ourselves off as knowing as much as we do know. One way to talk about the rational technological paradigm is to say that it's all about having objective knowledge about things and using that objective knowledge to attain outcomes that we want, outcomes that are favourable to us. So we know the outcome and we want to get things to be in accordance with this outcome, and so we do stuff. We could do any kind of stuff, but whatever it is we do, that's the stuff that gets the right outcome. And that's all that the rational technological approach comes down to, and it works very well in the physical world. It doesn't work entirely well because there's consequences we haven't seen that will come back to bite us. But to a certain extent, it does work impressively. We can't really argue about that. And so this is exactly what we do. We assume that this approach is going to work for mental health. So we assume it's all about knowing the right outcome, which we automatically think we do know what the right outcome is, because we automatically think we do know what mental health is. And then we have to have some evidence-based way of getting to there. And it sounds so impressive. If we heard it and we didn't know any better, which we probably don't, we'd be completely convinced. And yet, this whole approach of getting things to be the way that they ought to be or we want them to be is complete nonsense in the field of psychology. We don't have that knowledge. We don't have any knowledge at all. We're shooting in the dark. We absolutely do not know anything about consciousness or how the psyche works or anything like that. Our only knowledge is trivial knowledge, superficial knowledge that isn't really knowledge at all. It's like taxonomy. We can make categories and fit things into the categories, but there's no deep principles. There's no understanding of laws or rules behind it. It's just It's just the external facade of science, as Richard Feynman says. So the other approach that we could use, which is the antithesis of the rational technological, is something we don't even think of in the field of mental health. It doesn't even occur to us. But what it is simply a matter of, let's see what happens next. Simple as that. There's no more complications to it than that. So the first paradigm is, I already know what I want to happen, so let's make it happen the way I want it to be. That's very easy to understand. We do it all the time. If we do that successfully, we're a winner. If we can't do it, then we're walking around with a big loser sign on our heads. And the other way, there's no meaning in losing, because all we're doing is seeing what happens next, which is a remarkably simple thing. We need only think of a child looking around the world thinking, ooh, what's going to happen next? They may not articulate it in that way, but that's what lies behind it. What's going to happen next? Interest in what happens next. There isn't enough prejudices, there isn't enough assumptions, there isn't enough intellectual stuff there to make that jump, which is the jump of intellectual pride, really, to say, I know what should happen next, or I know what the good thing is to happen, and I also know how to make it happen. Kids don't have that. They don't need it, obviously. They get on very well without it. They don't interfere with stuff. They just go with it. But we, of course, have become to the stage where we only believe in our own interference, and we only believe in what we think is the case or shouldn't be the case. There's no exploration of the unknown. There's no looking to see what happens. And in the field of mental health, it is true to say that actually we don't want to look to see what happens. The whole point is that, no, I don't want to know what happens next. I want to stop it. I want to make something else happen, or at the very least, I want to make this not happen. And that's not a cultural thing. That's a basic human thing. It's a basic human thing called fear of the unknown, or fear of something which seems to be very challenging, which can be the unknown, and it can be something that's threatening my belief structures, or it could be something that's very, very uncomfortable or painful. So when we look at the very first, go back to the first paradigm of getting things to happen the way we want to, that automatically sounds attractive to us because of fear. Because there's two things here. There's fear or curiosity. When fear comes onto the scene, there's no curiosity. It's either one or the other. So then when fear's on the scene, everything becomes controlling. And somehow we believe that operating on the basis of fear and controlling to the maximum is going to bring about a state of mental health. When actually we know that being afraid is not a state of mental health. Or rather, we could say being afraid and legitimizing the fear, so that we don't even know it's fear anymore, but we think that we're doing the only possible thing we could do. That is the antithesis of mental health. So we've started off from this basic premise of risk avoidance, and then we turn that into a whole technology of control. And whereas that would be quite appropriate in the physical world if we were manufacturing products or building structures that we want to know are totally safe, it is wildly inappropriate in the field of mental health. Now, for a start, we don't know what mental health is. We think we do. But that is just a cultural prejudice, or it's either a cultural prejudice or it's just some kind of assumption that we make ourselves that is very, very superficial. For example, if we look at adverts on TV and we see happy people leading meaningful lives, or programs on TV or films, we see that's mental health because they're also happy and bubbly and people having a great life, so that must be mental health. But it isn't, of course, because it's an act. Well, obviously it's an act because they're on TV, but even in real life we are acting because society is a show. It's not a genuine thing. Obviously society isn't a genuine thing. It's a show. You have to put on the right face and do the right things and present the right image. So nothing there is mental health. So even when we seem to be doing well within the context of society and say, look, they've got all the things that you need to have, you're doing all the things you need to have, you've got the kudos for being good at whatever things you're supposed to be being good at. No way is that mental health, because it's just a societal game. So we're good at playing the game. Being good at playing the game is not the same as mental health, because the game itself is not healthy. This isn't to say that games aren't ever healthy or that they're always pathological. It's natural to play games, but we're talking about a particular type of game here where we play a game but refuse to admit that it is a game and get very, very serious about it and exclude all other possibilities and demonize all other possibilities. So this is what you could call serious game playing, unconscious game playing. And what happens in unconscious game playing is because we refuse or don't acknowledge that or see that it is a game, the game plays us. It's always the way. The game, when we're not aware that it's a game, plays us, and we think we're playing the game. So we're fundamentally deluded, and no matter how we try, we can't really say that being fundamentally deluded is in any sense good mental health. Of course, we could be deluded that we have good mental health, but that's just part of the delusion. That's just part of the game. So we really don't know as much about mental health as we collectively imagine that we do. Actually, if we did have mental health, society would fall to pieces. It can't actually work, as Robert Anton Wilson has observed, and many others, I'm sure, have observed. Society doesn't work with mentally healthy people, autonomous people, people who think for themselves. It only works when we're totally programmed, totally deluded. It only works when we don't see the truth. So we could define mental health as saying it's when we're able to tell the truth from fabrications. It's a good way of looking at mental health. Seeing through the facade, seeing through the game. So we could say that mental health is when we don't play the game. So I'm not playing this game anymore. Of course, everyone else who is playing the game without knowing that they're playing the game, well, they'll turn on us and say, you're mentally unwell because you're not playing the game. But they won't say, because you're not playing the game. But that's the logic behind it, really. So what we're talking about here is everything gone completely backwards. And if we can't understand that conditioned life, it turns everything on its head, turns all the natural values on its head. We really can't consider ourselves to be saying anything meaningful within, or doing anything meaningful within the sphere of mental health. And yet, curiously, it's never ever stressed or considered even that in order to work in the field of mental health, it's very, very important not just to be parroting everything we've been told and parroting everything that we've been trained to believe, and that absolute autonomy is the only way we can be mentally healthy, when we're not being influenced by the group mind, when we're not being influenced by everyone around us, when we're not being influenced by culture. So we actually have to break with culture to be mentally healthy. And yet the way we do it is, of course, we try to make people who aren't mentally healthy, supposedly, be more congruent with culture, and then we say, well done, you're right. You're righting yourself now, you're good to go. Off you go. Carry on doing all the good stuff you were doing before you had your breakdown or whatever it was. So that is our current approach. Absolutely. I can't see how anyone could possibly disagree with anything about that. Obviously, it's our current approach. The other approach, which isn't our current approach, which isn't any sort of approach at all, really, very much, is to have no technology, no methods, no idea about where we want to go, no idea about what mental health is, and no rejection of our present situation as being wrong or erroneous or not mental health. And this other paradigm, as I started off by saying, just involves see what happens next. And the interesting thing about see what happens next is no technology is needed because it's going to happen anyway. The whole point is that we don't make something happen because that wouldn't be true. That would be artificial. The whole point is see what happens next all by itself, spontaneously, naturally. So that requires only one thing. It doesn't require knowledge of what's happening because we don't know and there's no expectation that we should know. There's no expectation that we should know what's right or wrong or what helps or what doesn't help and there's no need for evaluation or judging, in other words. What is required is courage because we sure as hell don't know what's going to happen and neither does anyone else. So the big question is, do we really want to know? And if we do, that's mentally healthy. And if we don't, then that simply means that we're afraid, but we're not even willing to admit to our fear, but instead we validate our fear and say it's the right and correct thing to do. Okay, thanks for watching.